During patch 1.4, Wuthering Waves was at its lowest point. There wasn't a main story, just an event quest. That quest was time-gated too. Content felt stale, discussion was drying up, and for a lot of players, it genuinely felt like the game had lost its momentum. And for a while, the community just went quiet. That silence didn't break until the drip marketing for 2.0 started. Dong's video message lit a spark, the live stream carried the hype forward, and by the time 2.0 launched, people were paying attention again. And with it came the Rinascita arc. Hi, I'm Seriflor, and this is my review of the Rinascita story in Wuthering Waves. This review assumes you played the story. If you haven't, go do that first. Then come back before the dark tide arrives. Rinascita, at its fundamental level, is not a groundbreaking story. It's a battle between humanity and fate, faith versus corruption, dark forces manipulating the past, present, and future of an entire continent. None of that is new. And honestly, that's fine. Rinascita doesn't try to ask big, philosophical questions. It doesn't try to deconstruct its genre or lecture the player. What it does instead is tell a familiar story extremely well. On paper, the Rinascita arc can feel disjointed. It's episodic, it's very character-focused. Sometimes it barely feels like a main story at all. It feels like a string of very elaborate character quests. But that presentation, the pacing within each patch, the visual direction, and the emotional beats elevate what would otherwise be a pretty average narrative into something that feels cinematic. Rinascita isn't special because it's unique. It's special because it's confident. One of the hardest things to pin down about Rinascita is its tone, because the tone changes almost every patch. Patch 2.0 feels like an adventure. Rover follows a message from their past self, survives a shipwreck thanks to Cetus the Tidebreaker, gets rescued by the Troop of Fools, and slowly gets introduced to Raguna's politics, religion, and power structure. Patch 2.2 pivots hard into the mystery of Cardia, the Phasalias, and the Inverted Tower. Later patches then lean into tragedy, desperation, and outright horror as Leviathan's influence spreads. Normally, this kind of tonal whiplash would be a problem, but Rinascita avoids that because certain elements always anchor the story. Whenever Leviathan is mentioned or shows up, the tone becomes heavy and threatening. Whenever the Fraxides are involved, there's confusion, manipulation, and unease. The writers juggle these shifts surprisingly well. Nothing ever feels completely out of place, and when you step back and look at the arc as a whole, it tells a very clear story about people confronting doubt, faith, and fear, and either breaking under that pressure or becoming stronger because of it. Now, we need to talk about the biggest flaw in Rinascita. The episodic story structure absolutely hurts how the characters are handled. Characters tend to resolve their arcs in the patch that introduces them, and then they're gone. Not dead, not written out, just irrelevant until the plot decides to use them again. Rochia vanishes after 2.0. Phoebe vanishes after 2.1. Carlotta and Zani fade into the background. And let's not even start with Lupa yet. We'll get there. If you're used to ensemble casts, this is frustrating. Players want characters to remain relevant, even if they're not in the spotlight. Rinascita barely does that. By the time patch 2.6 rolled around, a lot of players were already burned. Even though 2.6 was excellent, the prevailing thought had become, why get invested? They'll just disappear anyway. That mindset did real damage to player enjoyment. And that's a shame, because the story itself didn't deserve that level of disengagement. This leads to what I call non-arcs. Characters who technically have stories, but whose presence doesn't meaningfully change the narrative state. They exist, they solve something, and then are shelved. With that in mind, let's talk about the characters who actually work and why. Carlotta is the blueprint. As the heir to the Montelli family, she's integral to 2.0. Her actions allow Rover to confront Frolova, save Ragusa, and kickstart political change in a city that desperately needed it. After her companion quest, she doesn't just vanish. She continues working off-screen, cooperating with the Order of the Deep, pushing Rinascita's echo technology outward, and eventually entering a truce with the Phasalias. When we see her again, we see results. That's the key difference. Carlotta has a complete arc and continued development. She represents the future Ragusa is trying to build. Out of the 2.0 cast, she gets the most consistent and satisfying treatment, and her companion quest is the cherry on top. Cantarella has to be one of my favorite character subversions in Rinascita. The marketing sets her up as this manipulative mastermind, someone pulling the strings from the shadows. And then you actually meet her, and she's kind, thoughtful, careful. Cantarella manages her image because she has to. The Phasalias are built on buried truths, and she shoulders that burden willingly. Her relationship with Cardia is genuinely endearing, and her sacrifice, giving Cardia the chance to oppose Leviathan, defines her character. After 2.2, she actively works to repair relations within Ragusa, and by 2.7, she's standing shoulder to shoulder with Carlotta against the Dark Tide. She's subtle, and Rinascita needed that. Let's talk about Lupa. Lupa is where Rinascita's episodic structure hurts the most. She's introduced as an honorable gladiator, dragged into the Fraxidus' experiments, and used as a pawn in a plan to drown Septimont in the Dark Tide. When she finally takes her agency back, when she chooses to fight Mia, that moment matters. She's a hero that saves Septimont from certain doom, someone Rover trusted to get the job done. And then Lupa stops existing. She doesn't investigate the Fraxidus, she doesn't show up during the hunt, there's no follow-up. Her arc resolves and the story moves on. And this is where the structure really shows its cracks. Lupa is exactly the kind of character who should be developing on screen, working under orders of Augusta, digging into Fraxidus activity, showing up briefly to remind us that she's still there. Instead, she's written and abandoned. And yeah, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Now, let's talk about Augusta. Augusta is not a character who goes through a dramatic emotional transformation, and that's intentional. From the moment she's introduced, Augusta knows exactly who she is. She fought to get to where she stands. She clawed her way into authority in Septimont, and she understands the cost of leadership far better than most characters in Rinascita. When we learn about her past in Murmurstown, it doesn't break her. It doesn't awaken some buried doubt or cause a sudden revelation. If anything, it just reinforces her worldview. Even when the false sovereign attempts to overwrite her body, Nothing fundamentally changes, and that's the point. If Augusta did suddenly doubt herself or unravel, fall into panic attacks, and have a breakdown, it would feel wrong. She isn't someone searching for meaning. She's someone who already understands the stakes and chooses to bear them anyway. Augusta represents resolve. She is a character who embodies the idea that strength doesn't always come from growth. Sometimes it comes from certainty. In a story filled with people questioning their beliefs, that is what makes her stand out. Yuno, on the other hand, is a much more contentious character, especially over here in the West, and I understand why. Her half of the story leans heavily into her relationship with Rover. It's intimate, it's dramatic, and yes, it borders on being a date. That rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, especially when Augusta felt sidelined during the half of the patch. But here's the thing, Yuno is supposed to feel different. Yuno's role in Rinascita isn't about leadership or authority, it's about inevitability. Her precognitive abilities show her outcomes she cannot escape. She knows what's going to happen, and she knows the cost. That's why she sacrifices her existence to give Rover and Augusta a chance in 2.6. It isn't framed as a tragic mistake or a noble gamble. It's presented as a certainty. Without Yuno, Rover never gets the opening they need. Without Yuno, Septimont falls, full stop. You don't have to like how personal her quest is, but narratively, Yuno matters more than people give her credit for. Her sacrifice isn't romanticized. It's sudden, confusing, and feels wrong. It's why Rover tries so hard to save her from her fate. Rover's disdain and fear of others sacrificing themselves is in full display here. Yuno's sacrifice was necessary, and her revival shows us the side of Rover that can't let go. Now, we need to talk about Galbrina properly, because she could have gone very wrong. On paper, Galbrina is the textbook definition of a plot device. A powerful figure who appears late in the story, helps the protagonist, and tilts the scales just enough to make victory possible. Rinascita avoids this pitfall, and it does so very deliberately. Galbrina is introduced with ambiguity. We don't know where her loyalties lie. Her morality is questionable. Her connection to Augusta gives her history, but not convenience. We learn that she has spent years resisting Leviathan. Not triumphantly, but painfully. Every victory costs her something. Every compromise weighs on her. And crucially, Galbrina does not save Rover, she supports them. Her role in 2.7 is about lifting Rover out of despair, not replacing them. When Rover becomes the Harbinger and Cristoforo offers them oblivion, Galbrina is the one that pulls them back, not with power, but with resolve. That distinction matters. Galbrina isn't a deus ex machina. She is proof that resisting Leviathan is possible, even if it scars you. Now we need to talk about Avidius properly, because if I didn't, people would rightfully be annoyed with me. Avidius is a tragic character by design, not by circumstance, not by poor choices, but by intent. His creator, Cristoforo, didn't just write scenarios, he created people, and Avidius was created for a singular purpose: to inherit the memories of the Mad King Caligula and become him, another harbinger of the Dark Tide. Everything Avidius believed about himself, his achievements, his memories, his sense of worth, was fabricated. When he learns the truth, he breaks. And honestly, that breakdown is one of Rinascita's strongest and quietest emotional moments. because it isn't loud or dramatic. It's personal and devastating. He isn't angry at the world, he's hollowed out by it. What makes Avidius special isn't his suffering, though. It's what he does after. In 2.7, when Ragusa is under siege and a tide spawn are flooding the streets, Avidius chooses to stand and defend the people anyway. Not because it was written for him, not because it was expected, but because, for the first time, the choice is his. After being drawn into the civilization capsule, even after being infected by Leviathan and Caligula's memories, Avidius resists. With Rover and Galbrina's help, he manages to die on his own terms, as himself, not as Caligula's shadow. Avidius was never meant to be important. He was an NPC, a tool in Cristoforo's script, and somehow he became one of Rinascita's most memorable characters. That's not an accident. That's good writing. Cardia is functionally the second protagonist of the Rinascita arc, and the story treats her that way, even if it doesn't always announce it outright. We first encounter her at the end of 2.0, and at that point she's an ethereal presence. We don't know what she is, we don't know whether she's a Sentinel Resonator, a Threnodian Resonator, or something in between. She's curious yet distant, basking in the afterglow of the Carnival. And then she disappears. When we see her again in 2.2, it's through Cantarella's intervention and the journey into the Inverted Tower. This is where the truth starts to unravel. Cardia is both the Sentinel and Threnodian Resonator, a creation of Leviathan, given a second awakening via the fusion of Leviathan and Imperator. She is, by definition, a contradiction. After we defeat Fleur-de-Lis, her first major act is forcing Rover to kill her, and that alone tells you how different she is from almost every other character on Rinascita. Where Rover is defined by almost pathological fear of sacrifice, Cardia embraces it, not out of nihilism, but out of responsibility. She believes if she has to die to stop Leviathan, then that is simply the price she has to pay. After Imperator restores her life, Cardia doesn't stay. She doesn't attach herself to Rover, she leaves the tower and goes to Septimon, where she immediately is caught up in the Fraxidus' plans to drown the city in the Dark Tide. This is important because it shows Cardia is never chasing Rover's shadow. She is running alongside them. Cardia doesn't want to rely on Rover. She doesn't want to be protected by them, she wants to be their equal. That desire culminates in 2.7, where she conspires with Galbrina to enact a plan that essentially requires her to die in order to permanently defeat Leviathan. She does this knowing Rover would never agree. This isn't a sense of betrayal, this is agency. Cardia takes her fate into her own hands. She rejects being Leviathan's vessel and rejects the idea that Rover has to carry the burden alone. And this is where Rinascita's episodic structure actually works in her favor. Because Cardia isn't present every patch, her reappearances feel deliberate. Each time she returns, she's changed. Not emotionally, but strategically. She has more information, more resolve, more clarity. Her arc doesn't reset when she leaves the screen. It advances off-screen. By the end of Rinascita, Cardia stands as Rover's equal. Not as a love interest, not as a dependent, but someone who understands the weight of the world just as deeply as they do. If Rover represents resistance through connection, then Cardia represents resistance through resolve, and Rinascita needed them both. Rinascita is where Rover finally becomes a real character. The developers try to make Rover stand on her own as their own character in 1.x, but it led to some mixed results. By 1.3, however, many could argue that Rover was their own character with their own motivations, but it wasn't until 2.0 where that elevated even further. Their fear of sacrifice, their savior complex, their desperation to protect others, it's all tested, challenged, and exploited. Cristoforo especially knew how to push those buttons. By 2.7, when the dark tide seeps in and Rover has become the Harbinger, Rover is at their lowest point. They're broken, manipulated, and nearly driven to end themselves. The fact that they don't break is because the bonds they formed along the way. This arc earns Rover's heroism. I want to talk about the antagonists now. The antagonists are the strongest point of Rinascita. They are definitely the highlights. And I think this is where the arc genuinely excels. The villains aren't just obstacles for Rover to overcome. They are philosophical threats to the protagonists and the world. Let's start with the Fraxidus as a whole. In 1.0, they were honestly pretty underwhelming. They were just masked, vague threats, barely shonen anime villains lurking in the shadows type of energy. And Rinascita fixes that. The Fraxidus aren't improvising chaos. They've already made their plans. Everything we see unfold is an experiment, a test of human behavior under pressure. To them, the lament is inevitable. Their solution isn't trying to stop it, but to evolve humanity past a point where it matters. They aren't trying to rule the world, they are trying to save the species no matter the cost. Cristoforo is a standout antagonist, not because he's powerful, but because of how he sees the world. He views reality as a stage, people as actors, events as scripts. And fittingly, his forte allows him to write those scripts. His goal in Rinascita is not domination, it's realization. He wants tragedy to manifest fully, layered onto reality itself. That's why he creates the Sonospheres. That's why he frames Lupa and Mia as tragic heroes in 2.4. That's why he pushes Rover so relentlessly. He doesn't hate Rover, he expects things from them. And that makes him incredibly dangerous to a protagonist defined by compassion and self-sacrifice. Now, Cristoforo gets compared to Aizen from Bleach a lot, and I get why. Both are always one step ahead, both manipulate perception, and both of them feel untouchable. But this is where the comparison usually stops, and where it should stop. Aizen is driven by ambition. He wants to stand at the top of the heavens. He rejects authority and seeks to replace it with himself. He's a Nietzschean Ubermensch, self-defined, self-justified, and utterly intolerant of equals. Cristoforo is the opposite. He never questions the world, he thrives in it. He doesn't want to change reality, he wants to watch it play out beautifully. He doesn't resent the system, he enjoys it. He doesn't challenge Rover because he's frustrated by them. He challenges Rover to see if they can live up to the role he's written. And when it's time for him to exit the stage, he fully intends to do so gracefully. Cristoforo isn't a conqueror. He's an elegant sociopath. And frankly, I think giving him a tragic backstory would completely undermine what makes him compelling. Frolova is defined by a single moment, the destruction of her hometown. That's when time stops for her, literally and emotionally. She stops aging, she stops moving forward, Everything she does afterward is in service of reclaiming what she lost. She joins the Fraxidus for that reason alone. Her Sonoro, the Lost Beyond, is not a weapon. It's a mausoleum, a place where the dead can remain, preserved by frequency. Her connection to Rover makes her even more tragic. She once admired them, but when Rover wiped their memories and disappeared, that admiration turned into bitterness, culminating in their confrontation. And about her death in 2.5, no, it wasn't permanent, it was never meant to be. Death is an inconvenience to Frolova, not an ending. Her return in 2.7 was expected. The only question was when. Schwarzlock and Scar are also present in the story. We learn that Schwarzlock can disguise himself as anyone he pleases, and uses his various disguises in 2.5 and in 2.7, and in the epilogue quest with Cho Yuan. Scar also shows up, finally released from jail to cause chaos as usual. We don't have much info on them, so I'll keep this section about them short. But it's clear that Schwarzlock is someone Rover once knew from the past. Fenrico might be the most tragic antagonist in Rinascita. He could have been one of Rover's greatest allies if things played out differently. He rose to power when Ragusa was at its lowest, after the Dark Tide consumed Avenolium. His desire to protect his people drove him to rewrite history, suppress truth, and collaborate with the Fraxidus. All of it to preserve stability. He's similar to Frolova in that regard, where both took extreme measures to achieve their goals. However, unlike Frolova, who remains shackled to a few, Fenrico feels responsibility for an entire region of people. And that's how Leviathan found its way into him. You can see the corruption as early as 2.0. Isolating dissenters, weaponizing the order, ruling through fear. By the time Rover confronts him in 2.5, Fenrico is barely himself. Our victory over him isn't triumphant. It's a Pyrrhic victory. Rover removes the last barrier protecting Ragusa from the Dark Tide. Fenrico's final act, sacrificing himself, may have been the only decision he made free of Leviathan's influence in a long time. Fenrico's spirit returning to help us at the climax of our battle against Leviathan in 2.7 was a much needed catharsis for such a tragic character who only wanted to do right by his people. Let's talk about Leviathan now. The Threnodian of Rinascita, and with their power of assimilation, they are able to wreak havoc across the region. We see a Leviathan attack the mine, causing Fenrico's slow insanity and the multiple attempts at corrupting Augusta and even Rover. We've seen them corrupt characters like our old adversary Gilberto in 2.7 and Mia in 2.4. Heck, they even corrupted Abby to the point where Rover became a harbinger as well. Leviathan's power was even enhanced thanks to merging with Imperator, the Sentinel of Rinascita. Thanks to that, Leviathan gained Imperator's authority over separation, which allowed Leviathan to be a formidable foe when it came time to do battle with him. We didn't get to see Leviathan's threat level for ourselves until 2.4, but from that moment onward, we were made aware of just how deadly the Threnodian can be, and it makes them a fitting antagonist. Leviathan doesn't just rely on brute strength, it's a psychological antagonist that uses its assimilation to create a paradise for humanity. It feeds on faith and belief from the Order and manipulated to Ragunezi into worshipping it. And after acquiring knowledge from Imperator, it sought to create a perfect physical vessel for itself in the form of Mia and Cardia, whom Leviathan created their entire lives for this purpose. In 2.7, it used Rover as the new harbinger to locate and infect the civilization capsule to reshape and mold civilization as they saw fit. However, despite all of the misdeeds and machinations, we don't know too much about Leviathan. As Leviathan's cries of betrayal to Abby is a lingering thought in the back of every player's mind. There could be more to Leviathan or the Thornodians than we could have possibly imagined. And if so, it may upend everything we know about Solaris 3 as a whole. It could recontextualize why Leviathan was so adamant into creating a perfect vessel, why they wanted to reshape civilization, and why they left so many victims in their wake. Even without the context, Leviathan remains a perfect antagonist for a land bound by faith, dogma, and prophecy. Now that we've talked about the characters who worked, we need to talk about the ones who didn't. Not because they were poorly written, but because the story didn't know what to do with them afterward. These are the real casualties of Rinascita's episodic format. These aren't bad characters. In fact, that's what makes this frustrating. They're fully realized, likable, and interesting, but they have little to no relevance to the Leviathan plot once their introductory patch is over. Cho Yuan and another character are the exceptions. Cho Yuan exists in Rinascita for one reason: to remind us that the world is bigger than Rinascita. He's a cameo, yes, but a purposeful one. He bridges Huanglong, reintroduces Geshu Lin, and reminds us that there's still unfinished business in the region. Brant and Rochia serve their purpose during the Carnival. After that, they vanish. 7 patches go by with barely a mention of the Fool's Troop, no side quests, no follow-up, nothing. Rochia in particular feels completely irrelevant, and that's not an exaggeration. If you removed her from the story entirely, Rinascita would not change in any meaningful way. Zani fares slightly better, tied loosely to the Order of the Deep and the Vault subplot. But even then, her story is pushed to optional content. If you don't actively seek it out, she may as well not exist up until a certain point. And Chacona has it even worse. Her family's suffering is directly tied to the Order's corruption, which would make her an important character. Instead, her entire backstory is optional. If you don't do her event quest, she disappears until 2.7. This is where I want to ask a very blunt question. If these characters were removed from Rinascita, would the arc fundamentally change? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. That hurts, because these characters are good. They just aren't allowed to matter. Phoebe, however, is an interesting exception to all of this. For most of Rinascita, she's in the same boat as Brant and Rochia. Introduced, lightly involved, and then sidelined. It honestly felt like the writers had plans for her and then abandoned them. But in 2.7, that changes. Phoebe steps into a leadership role. She organizes the acolytes, tends to the wounded, leads relief efforts into Phasalia territory, and later appears in Septimont doing the same. And then Rover gives her the civilization capsule after the end of the story. That's not nothing. You don't hand an artifact like that to a character unless you intend to do something with them later. It feels like Phoebe went through an entire character arc off screen, and while that's still a structural problem, it at least tells me the writers haven't forgotten her. I hope they follow through. Now, let's talk about why Rinascita's episodic format works when it does work. The biggest strength of episodic storytelling is focus. Each patch has a clear goal. Let me give some examples. 2.0 is to become the laureate and save the Carnival from being cancelled by the church. 2.2 is to uncover the truth of the Dark Tide. 2.6 is the hunt. And 2.7 is the culmination. Kuro does an excellent job weaving the greater Leviathan plot into these world-building and lore pieces, all without regurgitating information or repeating things that we already know ad nauseum. World-building is delivered in chunks that matter right now, instead of being dumped all at once. Lore becomes the subject of the episode, not background noise. This could have easily become a mess if Kuro decided to include an ensemble cast every episode. This is a problem that the Trail series is running into more and more, and one great example is Trails of Cold Steel 4. Cold Steel 4 is the climax of the Erebonia arc in the Trail series. It started off with an episodic narrative before it ballooned into an Avengers-esque story by the 4th game. It had the opposite approach. Massive continuous narrative and bloated cast. Every character needed to say some one-liner in a cutscene, and every reunion needed screen time. The pacing suffers because the story is dragging its own weight. Rinascita avoids this problem. Another thing that Rinascita avoids is having B and C plots moving alongside the A plot with constant POV switching. Cold Steel 4 has this problem as well, however it handles POV switching better than what I could say about The Last of Us Part 2. You know, where no one wants to experience the POV of a character that murdered your favorite in a fit of rage. Rinascita doesn't stop the plot so everyone can speak. It doesn't juggle B and C plots just to remind you they exist. It stays locked in on the A plot of the episode. That allows stronger visual direction, cleaner set pieces, tighter emotional beats, and yes, characters do get left behind, but that's the cost. But the benefit is momentum. And Rinascita uses that momentum to full effect in 2.7. I talked about Rover before, but the episodic storytelling of Rinascita really works wonders for his character. It allows Rover to adapt without derailing the narrative, and new characters Rover meets can be used as mirrors or reveal hidden sides of themselves that not even the Rover realized. And finally, every encounter causes the Rover to have a subtle change on their outlook. They accumulate emotional weight after each encounter, and the weight feels earned. And we see that weight culminate in 2.7. Their heroism is earned through the series of choices they've made over the course of the narrative, and it makes Rover feel more like a hero than their contemporaries in the gacha space. Rinascita isn't perfect. Some characters are sidelined, some arcs don't carry forward the way they should, the episodic structure absolutely causes problems, but what Rinascita achieves outweighs those flaws. It elevated Wuthering Waves' narrative, established real antagonistic threats, and finally delivered a protagonist worth following. It feels conclusive, while still leaving room for the future. And after everything, I can confidently say this: Rinascita was made with the players in mind. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Beautiful.